Yes, and we are welcoming Michael Knudsen, who is talking about Bluetooth.
Okay, yes, so this is a talk on Bluetooth Low Energy. So this is like just a brief overview. First I'm going to talk a bit about classic Bluetooth, just to sort of set some reference as to what is actually low energy about this. And then I'll talk about low energy, and hopefully I'll have time for some demos. Okay, so first of all, what is in this talk? This is not like a hardcore talk on Bluetooth Low Energy. This is supposed to give you an idea of the principles and the design decisions. What are the goals that you're trying to achieve with this talk, and sort of give you an idea of the rough ideas of of how this is actually implemented, how this works. So what is not in this talk is none of the host stack and applications aspect. You could say that this is because it's sort of radio-centered. I'm not going to talk about security or competing technologies because I'm not familiar with these aspects. So okay, so first of all, classic Bluetooth. So classic Bluetooth operates in like the 2.4 gigahertz frequency spectrum, just like Wi-Fi and lots of other stuff. So it's there's like 79 channels of 1 megahertz each, and the connection topology is like you can have a maximum of 7 connections, and they're all sort of connected to some sort of central master. There's a bunch of different versions of classic Bluetooth. I've left out some of the really old ones here. So like the classic Bluetooth has a bandwidth of 1 megabits or 3 megabits or whatever, depending on which standard you're implementing. So in 2.0 we got the new enhanced data rate, which took bandwidth to 3 megabits. And in 3.0, they implemented this scheme of being able to use what is called an alternate MAC-PHY, which is basically, this allowed you to use Wi-Fi to do file transfers, like offloading large data transfers to Wi-Fi. In practice, nobody really uses this. In 4.0, which I think came out in 2010, we got this new idea of the Bluetooth Low Energy aspect of this. And there's a new spec, 5.0, coming out, which is a bunch of extensions to the LE spec, which, for instance, like 2 megabits long range and some direction finding scheme. So, okay, the topologies in classic Bluetooth is that you can have like a single master and a single slave, or you can have a single master which has a bunch of slaves, or you can have like complex topologies where there's a bunch of masters which have a number of slaves associated with them. And some of these masters are slaves on some links and masters on their own link. There's the scheme of the master repeatedly pulling its slaves, so just checking, do you have something for me, or here's some data for you, which means the slaves have to be alive a lot of the time to be able to respond to these queries. It's possible to do a role switch such that you become the master on the link instead of the master, which means that sometimes you can save a bit of power by deciding when to actually do radio communication. And there's the scheme for doing this device discovery and setting up connections is done through paging, where the possible clients are required to every now and again go out and listen for what is called paging for fairly long periods of time. So this is sort of the classic Bluetooth. Okay, so quickly about Bluetooth Low Energy. It was originally developed at Nokia under the name of Vibri. It was taken in by the Bluetooth Special Interest Group, and they've tried to use a lot of different names for it. So like Bluetooth Low Energy Bluetooth, BLE, Bluetooth Smart. I think there is even more names, but it's from a branding perspective, this is a bit confusing. This is not very successful. So, okay, before we head more into Bluetooth Low Energy, just a brief detour about sensors. If we have like sensor networks, we often have different kinds of network topologies. Like we can have where something is broadcasting it, or you can have like something is just broadcasting, the temperature is 50 degrees. Or you can have like point-to-point collection saying you set up a connection and you sort of sync to some device and you repeatedly listen to a sensor update from this particular device. Often sensors are battery or power constrained because we want them to be small because this makes them easy to put in some place without like being it's useful if they're small. You can put them everywhere. And also, this makes them cheap to produce. But this often puts a constraint on the battery size, which means they can't use a lot of power, because if they use a lot of power, the battery will drain in no time. So this is, so there's some physical constraints on this. Whereas often, when you look at the data collection side of this is often centralized. So you have some sort of thing that maybe connect. This is often maybe placed inside your house, like a temperature which shows, some display which shows what the temperature is outside or whatever. And these are often, these are maybe have big batteries because there's some sort of big screen on them, or maybe they're even connected to the electrical grid. So these get to use a lot of power. Yeah, and it's not as inconvenient changing the batteries in the units that are inside your house than going out to your garden and finding wherever you put the thermometer there. But really, this is not just for sensors. So whenever I say sensors in this, this is sort of in the sort of abstract sense. This is something that generates some data and something else wants to obtain this data. Okay, so low power 101. How do we actually achieve low power? Well, first of all, the idea is to have low peak power. Whenever we use the most power, we make sure this is very little. We try to do fast connections, and I'll come back to this later to say what this is. If we can have a fast connection, it means, this has some nice properties. And basically, well, fundamentally, we also want to do this so we have the maximum idle or sleep time. The more time we can make our devices do absolutely nothing, the less battery they will require. So, okay, low peak power. Basically, this is because we would like something to run off like a coin cell battery. I have some small tokens here, which are like, okay, so this is a development board, so this is not a very, this is not a design which is good for marketing. But anyway, these are a small runoff, like a CR2032, and they can run off for maybe a year or two. And basically, you can use these for various purposes. So these devices run off a coin cell battery for a long period of time. Okay, so in classic Bluetooth, there's this concept of having power classes, where you can say, I'm a power class where I can transmit up to this amount of power. And there's a somewhat complex scheme for devices trying to figure out whether to increase or decrease the signal strength. Like if someone is yelling, you can tell them to like turn it down a notch. Also, low peak power means we state that we would like a receive sensitivity at minus 70 dBm. But really, we expect real world devices to be able to work at minus 90 dBm. So this means that the devices must be able to pick up quite faint signals. Finally, there's something in RF called the modulation index. And for LE, this is 0.5, and for classic Bluetooth, this is 0.25. Basically, this means that it's much easier to distinguish a 0 from a 1 in LE than it is in classic Bluetooth. So this gives increased robustness for a given power level. And when you have increased robustness, this means that with the smaller amount of power, your signal can be transferred on longer distances and still be able to be picked up correctly at the other end of the connection. So, yeah, so that's low peak power. Fast connections. So basically, in order to do device discovery in classic Bluetooth, we have to go out and listen for paging for 20 milliseconds at a time. Whereas we have to send out paging packets for 20 milliseconds at a time. Whereas in LE, what we do is called advertising, and we do this, and these take down to 2 milliseconds. In order to establish a connection in classic Bluetooth, you can have maybe somehow, this takes on the order of maybe 100 milliseconds, because you have some complex negotiation scheme. Whereas in LE, there's a connection request which is over in 1 millisecond. And data transfer in LE is limited to taking 3 milliseconds at a time. So this is what we mean by fast connections. This is not fast as in a lot of bandwidth transferred at a time. This means that you have your radio turned on. You do your transmission quickly, so you can quickly turn off your radio. Okay, and finally, maximizing sleep time. So for classic Bluetooth, there's for paging, there's this scheme where it uses 16 or 32 channels to jump around and listen for paging. whereas in Bluetooth Low Energy you use 3 advertising channels. So basically this means that whereas in classic Bluetooth you have your radio turned on for 20 milliseconds, in low energy Bluetooth you can have it turned on for maybe just 625 or 1250 microseconds, which is much less. I mean, all these things combined together means that the idle current of your device is actually dominated by how much power does it use when it's not doing anything, just its sleep current, because most of the time it will be sleeping. And this is actually ideally suited for sensor applications, because often sensors have, I'm not saying always, but often sensors have a fairly low data transmission frequency. Like every hour your thermometer updates and says, now it's 2 degrees Celsius outside. So basically we want to make sure that the device can use very little power for the remainder of that hour. Basically this means that the amount of current that you're using when actually doing your radio transmission, it doesn't really matter in the picture, because most of the time you're not going to be transmitting anything or receiving. So this is really one of the big points of the sources of saving power. Okay, so the fundamentals of Bluetooth Low Energy is that we have 3 modes of operation. We have what is called advertising and scanning, and then you can have connections. These modes of operation used to be like partially mutually exclusive, but I think in the 4.1 spec these constraints were removed. But I mean, these constraints are not really relevant for sensor applications, at least on the sensor side, because typically you will not be doing all of these things at the same time. So yeah, it doesn't really matter. If you get a 4.0 device, it should still be fine for doing various sensor implementations. So okay, so first of all, I'm going to talk about connections. Connections are point-to-point. On a connection, there's a master and a slave, and there's only, I mean, we only have these 2 entities on the connection. Whereas in classic Bluetooth, you would have a master and up to 6 slaves, I think, 7. Basically, the key concepts that define this connection is we have something called connection events, and we have something called the connection interval. Essentially, you should see a connection in Bluetooth Low Energy as some sort of recurring rendezvous with what I call quasi-fixed periodicity. But I guess in some sense, all connections could be expressed to be like this. So, okay, so what is this? Connection events are basically evenly spaced points in time. And these are the only opportunities for communications between the 2 devices involved on a connection. The connection interval defines the time between connection events. So basically, the lower connection interval you have, the more power you will be using, because the more frequently you will be communicating with your peer device. And the connection interval can be from 7.5 milliseconds up to 4 seconds. And there's a granularity of 1.25 milliseconds. And once you've established the connection, you can actually renegotiate this connection interval if you want to change this. You can also do something called slave latency, where the master tells the slave device that you don't need to show up every time. You get to show up maybe only like 9 times out of 10, or 1 times out of 10 or whatever. So this allows the slave to sort of opportunistically say, I'm not going to wake up now because I'll just wake up for the following event, because that way I can save even more power. Or I can see that for the past hour, my temperature has not been changing, so I mean, it's not going to change in the next 4 seconds anyway. And it's also possible to sort of specify some sort of temporal displacement of connection events. This allows you to align your connection events with other periodic activities. Suppose you're a device, you only have 1 radio, and you have maybe 2 connections. So this allows you to make sure that the connections are not supposed to be serviced at the same point in time, because then you'll have to skip connecting to either device. But it also means that you can align your connections such that you turn on your radio, you do the communication when you have woken up to some other, like in 5 minutes my thermometer kicks in and gives me an interrupt with some sort of temperature reading. Just make sure that when that happens, I'll be doing my communication there as well, because otherwise you'll have to sleep and wake up only to do radio communication. So, I mean, this is this basically allows you to make the connection happen sort of at the point in time which is suitable to you. So basically, this shows the connection. We have a bunch of master-slave slots. So first, the master transmits, and then and during this point in time, the slave has this receiver turned on, and then there's a 150 microsecond gap, and then the master is listening and the slave is transmitting. So in these two slots, the device gets to, you can hear whether the other guy's there. For instance, if the master is doing something else, the slave can hear that, okay, the master wasn't there, so he can just go back to sleep and wait for the next connection event. Similarly, if the master doesn't get an acknowledgement after he's done his transmission, the slave is supposed to acknowledge and send back some data. If the master doesn't hear from the slave there, he knows that, okay, he's not around, so he can turn off his receiver early. So this is basically an LA connection. And there's some sort of fixed, the X milliseconds connection interval between each of these connection events. And as I said, these are the only points in time where these guys can actually communicate. So if after like a quarter of X milliseconds, the master realizes that he has stated that he would really like to send to the slave device, well, it's just too bad because he can't do it until in the next connection event. So these are when we do the data exchange. And you can exchange 31 bytes in the 4.0 spec, which is not a lot of data, but for instance, for temperature readings or pressure sensors or heartbeat monitors or whatever, this is, I mean, more than enough data. There's an optional extension where you can send, I think, up to 255 bytes. And there's also a sort of a neat thing where if you have a connection event, you can see that I've got 32 bytes that I would like to send to the other guy. Instead of having to wait maybe 4 seconds until you get to send the final byte, there's this point where you can set like what is called the more data bit in the header, which means that you tell the other guy that I have actually got I've got more data for you, and that requests him to after you have done your transmission, you tell him that you need to come back and listen again. There's no obligation for the peer device to come up again, but this, I mean, often this device will have the ability to do so. So, yeah, so I mean, this is, even though we can set a fairly high connection interval so that we sleep for a long time and still get to transfer a lot of data, albeit somewhat slowly, when we get to the connection point. So this is reasonably flexible. Okay, so advertising. Basically, advertising is where you configure your device to broadcast a packet and then optionally wait for a response. So these advertisement packets have 3 properties, and I know there's 4 items on the list. But today they can be directed, which means that they can have an address of the recipient on it. So for instance, I can put in, I would like this, I'm transmitting this packet and it's supposed to be my sports watch that's picking this up. It can also be connectable, which means that someone can respond to this and say, I would like to connect to you. And then finally it can be scannable, where which is an indication where it says, you can ask me if I have some more data than what I've just sent out. Finally, in the 5.0 spec, you get the 4th property where you can say that it's anonymous. So you can do a transmission, and it doesn't have it doesn't say give out your address. So basically, the other guy doesn't know who he might be connecting to or which thermometer this is or whatever. There's optionally you can put in some payload data where you get up to 31 bytes, which, for instance, could say that I'm a thermometer, my name is Bob, or whatever. So you could put in stuff such the other devices know whether it might be relevant to try to connect to you. Okay, so the 2 primary configuration options for the advertising is you get to set up at the interval at which you do this. You can also set up which of the 3 advertising channels you would like to use, but normally you just use all of them. The connection interval basically means that if you think what you're advertising is super important, you do a very low connection interval, which means you'll be waking up frequently and you'll be using a lot of power. So basically, this is what advertising looks like. So we got first an advertising on. So we got an advertising on channel 37, which is the first advertising channel. Then one on, and nothing happens after that. Then we have an advertising channel on, we have advertising on channel 38 and finally one on 39. And then basically we're done with this. Once we've done these 3 advertisings, we turn off the radio and maybe go back to sleep unless we have something else to do. I said earlier that you could optionally wait for a response. This is because you can get, well, okay, so the kinds of responses you can get is, you can get what is called a scan request, and you only get this, you're only supposed to get this if you have said that you're a scannable advertiser, or you can get a connection request. So if you get the scan request, this basically means that someone says, I would like to know more, and then you optionally can send back a scan response, which can be up to 31 bytes. And for instance, this could be that you're advertising saying, I'm a thermometer, and then this, the idea is that maybe you don't want to tell everybody which thermometer you is. You only do this extra transmission in case someone comes and tells you, I would like to know more. Then you can sort of save a bit of power by not transmitting all of it every time. But you can also get a connection request. And if you get a connection request, you don't respond to it. Instead, it's you have a rendezvous in 6 connection events. Basically, the connection event, the connection request tells you when to, where to show up in the radio spectrum at which point in time. And then you basically just say that the connection is started at this point in time. So this is what this figure is showing. So first we have an advertisement, and nobody responds to this. Then we have another advertisement, and somebody sends a scan request, and then we respond with a scan response. One thing I forgot to mention is after sending one of these advertisement requests, we wait 150. We send an advertisement. After sending one of these advertisements, we wait 150 microseconds, and then we turn on our receiver if we want to listen to a response. And if we don't hear anything in 150 microseconds, we can turn it off almost immediately because nobody is going to show up. There's no. The concept is that you show up 150 microseconds after the advertisement, and that's your only chance. If you show up at 152 microseconds, it's too late. So basically, this allows the guy who is advertising to determine when other people have the chance to talk to you. So if I'm doing an advertisement to say that I'm here, you can connect to me, I get to decide when I would like to listen for connection requests. And the idea is that the guy who's trying to establish if the connection is, for instance, in the thermometer scenario, that's my big base station inside the house. So he gets to have his radio turned on and listen and wait for my advertisements. And so this costs him power, but I can be sleeping for maybe like 4 seconds and before I do the radio transmission. So the advertiser side gets to decide sort of how much power would he like to invest in having this connection established. So this is quite actually this is pretty good design because you can be very aggressive about turning off your radio because you don't have to wait for maybe 10 milliseconds or just 1 millisecond for the guy to show up. He has 150 microseconds and that's it. Okay, so anyway, in this case we do the advertisement, we wait 150 microseconds, we get the scan request, then we wait 150 microseconds again, and then we do the scan response, and then we're done. He can't, after the scan response, he's not able to come and say, then I would like to connect. He has to wait. Yes, and once we've done this, so we go back to the final advertising channel, and then we do the advertising there. So this is the scenario where we connect. So we do an advertising, and nobody hears that. We do the next advertising, and then somebody hears this and waits the 150 microseconds and sends the connection request, and that's it. At this point, we are connected. So after receiving the connection request or sending it, we basically inform our host stack's upper layers that now we're connected to this guy. Because the idea is that normally this will actually succeed. So there's no point in waiting until we've heard from the other guy to actually get on with the connection. So upper layers might have to do some sort of initialization or whatever, and they can do this. Okay, so scanning. Let me just check the time. Scanning is basically the opposite of advertising. So this is listening for advertisements. And you do this in order to obtain the advertisement data, and you can do this in a passive or an active way. I'll get back to this. Or you can do this in order to do the connection establishment. So if we do the connection establishment, this is called initiation. So active versus passive scanning is basically whether you decide to respond to an advertisement with a scan request. So if you do active scanning, you send scan requests saying, I would like to know more. And then you wait for a response. So obviously, if you don't really care about devices in detail, you just do passive scanning. And then you leave it up to upper layers to reconfigure to active scanning if it looks like it might be starting to be relevant. And the idea is that you can also configure the scanning intensity simply by you set up scanning in two. You have two properties. Basically, you have the scan interval and the scan window. So that means the scan interval is from 2.5 millisecond up to 10.24 seconds. So you can set up your scanner saying every 10.24 seconds, I would like to scan for a window of 2.5 milliseconds. Or you can say every 2.5 milliseconds, I want to scan for 2.5 milliseconds. So you basically get to decide how much time would you like to spend scanning. And ultimately this means how much power would I like to use this. There's a granularity in scanning of 625 microseconds. So yes, the idea, as I said, with advertising is to offload the intensive part offloading the aspect of connection establishment or finding the other peer device to the device that actually wants to find you. Because if you're one of these devices, you don't really know if there's anybody around that would actually like to connect to you. So why should you be listening all the time just in case somebody might want to find you? So instead, the design is such that these guys decide when they would like others to have a chance to connect to them. So they can decide how much power to invest in establishing a connection. But still the other side can also say, I'm reasonably interested in scanning, so I'll be doing this half the time. Or I'm not very interested in scanning, so I'll do this like 10% of the time or whatever. So, okay, so once we're scanning and we found somebody, what do we do? Well, basically, if this is scanning and not connection establishment, I mean, we inform upper layers. So in the upper layers get maybe some data, which was in the advertisement packet, which they can inspect. So the upper layer, like the stack, this could be your cell phone, can see that, okay, there's a thermometer around, and I should try to connect to it. Basically, they can just react to the presence. Oh, the Bluetooth dongle, which is in my keychain, has entered the area. I should probably try to connect it or make it beep because it's been gone, and I need to find it. And then when you connect to it, you can send it a command so it'll turn on some buzzer or whatever. And also when you do the scanning, you get the chip informs you of the RSSI value. RSSI means received signal. What is it? Received signal strength indication. Basically, this is some sort of, it tells you how loudly you heard the peer device. And this can be used to get like an idea of the rough distance to the other device. And also if you're scanning repeatedly and you keep seeing the other device and the RSSI value changes from maybe -50 to a -80, you know, okay, we're probably moving away from each other. So it gives you some idea of the relative movement between you and the peer device. Okay, so when you do initiation, you respond to the advertisement with a connection request, and then immediately inform the upper layers of the connection. The master selects the connection parameters. So basically, the master can say, "I want to connect with this connection interval," and so basically, the master gets to choose how frequently to communicate. Both sides can change the parameters afterwards in case the parameters are not to their liking. Okay, so basically this was I guess the design ideas behind the Bluetooth Low Energy and how some of the low power things, low power aspect is achieved. So now I'll try to do a demo with, I had these two development kits which are very unhandy cell phones, and then I have these tokens that I've turned on that I will see that, I mean, you can go and search for these and it'll show how frequently devices can be found, and yeah. Okay, so for this I'm using a proprietary tool called BTCLI, which is not related to BitTorrent. So it's a command line interface using which you can emit the low-level control commands to set up your Bluetooth controller. I think in a lot of cases you'll have some sort of API which corresponds exactly to these commands. This tool is generally not available, but the company that did it may have more or less intentionally leaked it, so it might be possible to pick it up somewhere. Okay, so in this, right now I have two screens, so one for each phone. So I can try to read the Bluetooth address on one and read it on the other one. Okay, first I'll try to set up a connection just using regular Bluetooth. This sometimes takes a while, and sometimes it's reasonably fast. But this is a very simple connection. So often there's a lot of negotiation on top of this. But anyway, it's establishing the connection, and now it is. Yeah, I think it was connected now. So this took like, I don't know, maybe a second or so. I'll just disconnect this. Whoops. I'll try to set up an LE connection instead, and hopefully, I mean, if what I've said is true, this is a bit faster than the other thing. Whoops. Okay, so I'm connecting now. Okay, it's connected. So this was much faster. I can try to send these connection. I can try to send some data across, and so this also came across quite quickly. It says when the connection comes up that on this connection, this device is the slave device. It has a connection interval of 148, and I must admit I don't recall what the unit is. I think it might be 625 microsecond slots, but I'm not sure. Anyway, so this is a reasonably aggressive connection. These communicate fairly often. I can try to disconnect it again, and then I can try to make this. So what I've set up now is I've told the one device to try to connect to the other device again, the device that it was just connected to, but the other device is not advertising. So, but now I'll turn on the advertising on the other device, and we should see that reasonably quickly the connection comes up. Okay, it's already up. So basically my finger was still touching the return key. So this is how fast connection establishment is. So this means if you're a thermometer, you can basically do nothing, go out and scan, find the other device and connect, and then disconnect again, or the other device can do this. So, I mean, because the connections happen this fast, I mean, you don't really need to establish a connection in advance, but you can do it if this is convenient. I mean, this is basically, you get to choose this in your application. Also, this, as I said, in classic Bluetooth, there's this scheme where you and the master can trade places, so you become the master. There's nothing like this in LE, but if these guys wanted to turn off the connection, to do a role switch, it's much simpler to just disconnect and let the other guys do an advertisement, and then you connect back to him because it's just so fast. So I have complicated rules for doing role switches. Okay, so now I'll just demonstrate scanning, which is not for connection establishment. So let me I'll just do this on this device. So now I'm using, this is not one command, this is a command which sets up scanning with fairly aggressive scanning parameters, and then we should be able to see that some devices show up. Okay, so these are these tokens that show up. I can stop the scanning just so we can see what it is. So basically what we can see, this is what is called as an advertising report. Basically this says that this is an event from the controller saying I've found someone else. Sorry, I've found some device. This says CU here, which means that this is an advertiser that we could have connected to we could have responded with the connection request and established a connection. The address type is this device has made this transmission using its public address. So it's the address which is in the packet is actually the one which is wired in the ROM on the chip. And finally, there's some data in here which says this is a CSR security token. And finally, the received signal strength is minus 80 dBm, which is not very good, given that they are lying here. But these are development kits which don't have trimmed radios, so I mean, we shouldn't really expect real, like product-like performance from these. So I'll just restart the scanning, and then I'll try to set up the advertiser on the other side. So I'll do this, and then we can see that the other guy is advertising pretty frequently. And then I can stop it again, and then immediately it stops. So if we look at this, suddenly we start seeing these advertising reports show up much more frequently than the tokens. That's because the command I've used is intended for setting up connections, and this is not. These devices are not power constrained. So if I do this scanning again, and I start scanning over here, and then I can try to change the data. Just whoops. I just send out a bunch of A's, and these should show up in the data. Okay, okay, there's some bug here. I don't know with the tool. Anyway, we can see that the signal strength from the two phone devices is like a minus 30 dBm. So this is reasonably good. I mean, yeah, I don't know why. I think that maybe the radios on these tokens are not very good. I don't know. Yeah. Oops. So I think this was all I wanted to demonstrate. So, okay, moving on. In case there's any tinkerers out there, so if you want to hardware for this, it seems like there's a plethora of devices which have controllers from Nordic Semi. These are the NRF some numbers chips. These seem to be everywhere. TI seem to have some sort of chip which people also use for making these like Arduino stuff. I've seen a board from Red Bear Lab. Adafruit has some devices. Now there's like a $20 board from Seed, and you can get iBeacons, which are basically small devices. I mean, actually, an iBeacon is something like this, just with some Apple-defined protocol in the data that is transmitted. So, I mean, you can get a bunch of stuff. I think most cell phones today will have LE support, so you can. I mean, you might be able to pick up the signals from these tokens just using your cell phone. Yeah, so that's basically it. Any questions? Yeah.
You didn't talk about pairing, so is that handled in another layer?
Yes, so basically pairing is handled using. Okay, so the question is about pairing. In classic Bluetooth, pairing is done using like link level commands, but in LE, this is done using a higher level command. So you establish a connection and you send data packets back and forth saying, I would like to do a pairing with you. And then I think once you've done the pairing, you use some low level commands to set up your links saying, now it's encrypted, start using these keys. Pairing is on a level, I mean, it's higher up than what I normally do. So the details are a bit sketchy to me. So, okay. If there's no more questions, okay, one question.
What about the software? I mean, you mentioned some hardware features, but what about the software side of it in something like 20 units? What would be a good starting point to play around with software-wise? Is it Arduino, some library, or?
Okay, so the question is about I mean, software-wise, what is a good starting point? I think the Nordic boards, I haven't had a chance to use them yet, but I think they're actually quite cool because basically, I think what you do is they give you some library, and then you build an application which you link with this library, and then you program it directly onto their controller. So their controller is like seems like an IoT style controller where you put an application onto the actual controller, so you don't need to have a lot of you don't need an extra processor or whatever to do this. But I haven't had a chance to use them myself. Okay, so that's the last question. Just thanks for listening. And feel free to come and say hi if you want some sort of demo or whatever. Yeah, that's all.